Taking a break after a very lengthy closing statement, very methodical closing statement by prosecutor Steve Schleicher, going through all of the counts here, all three counts, and Heather really giving the jury their first chance to methodically understand what the elements are that they're looking for.
Absolutely. Chart it out for them, essentially, because if you look at each of these charges, these jurors have to consider the elements of the charges. You know, for example, in the second-degree murder charge, that the death must be proved, that the defendant caused the death, that he attempted to commit an assault at the time. So they have to go through element by element and answer those questions to then be able to go back and say, okay, we're going to find him guilty or not guilty of these second-degree, third-degree murder charges and the manslaughter charge, which I thought was interesting to do that, to help the jurors. He said, you can take my advice or not, but this is my guide to help you as you start your deliberations. The
closing statement from the state, a closing argument went on almost an hour and 45 minutes as Steve Schleicher. Main theme here, you can believe your eyes. And also speaking about, I think the quote was that he knew better, he just didn't do better, referring to policing.
Right. He said, use your common sense, believe your eyes. What you saw, you saw. What you saw happened. Let's bring in our legal analyst, Joe Tamburino, longtime criminal defense attorney. Here in Minnesota as we look live at the judge in the courtroom there in the middle of a 20-minute break, Joe, in between the prosecution and the defense here. Why don't we start just with your thoughts on what we heard in the prosecution's closing argument?
Good morning. Yes, what Mr. Schleicher did is he tied his theme to what Jerry Blackwell originally stated in his opening statement, which is believe your eyes. The video tells it all. The only thing I was surprised about is that Mr. Schleicher didn't use examples of things like what is substantial bodily harm? What is a loss of a bodily function? You know, going through examples of what could be substantial bodily harm, like a broken leg or a broken arm. And what does loss of consciousness means? Same thing with the third-degree murder. What does it mean to have a depraved mind, an eminently dangerous act? Other than that, he did a very fine job of weaving in everything that he had to prove the elements.
Joe, what stuck out to you most? What was most effective, do you think, with this jury?
Well, the visuals, because visuals always help, and what he did is he went through frame by frame the timeline of what happened when Mr. Chauvin's knee was on Mr. Floyd's neck, as well as the visuals that he gave about how to fill out the elements of the case. And that's where I was mentioning maybe more examples of what these elements really are would have been helpful, but the visuals definitely worked.
For sure, going through this very, I don't want to say dispassionately, Joe, but I think the opening statement from the prosecution was more emotional than what we saw here in the closing statement. Do we expect the emotion to come in when the state gets another chance after the defense gives its closing argument?
Yes, we would expect so. Now, rebuttal argument has to be specifically rebutting something that the defense raises. So it can't just be a second closing argument. But I agree, this wasn't a real emotional argument. It started out a little bit slow. It built up later on, but it wasn't like the opening statements.
But Joe, we have to remember here, too, of course, you can't play off of the jurors' emotions, sort of how they feel. And this was a constant reminder from the judge early on, too, is you have to follow the law and what the law says. So yet another reminder here, especially going through that chart there, that they have to answer some questions affirmatively or negatively before they can really go ahead and make those decisions.
That's correct, but we also have to keep in mind that the courtroom is like a stage and trial is like theater in many, many ways. And the power of persuasion and emotion is extremely important because it helps get your point across to the jury.
This does go to show, Joe, I think some people are, trying to guess and see how long they think the jury will deliberate. But just the chart that Steve Schleicher pulled out during his closing lets you know that there are a lot of individual questions that the jurors have to answer. And the judge in his jury instructions laid it out that all of these charges need to be considered separately. You can't just go through and say, well, we've got a guilty on second degree, so it follows right down the line that he's guilty of third and he's guilty or not guilty either way, right?
That's absolutely correct. And it was very good that the judge gave almost all of the instructions before the attorneys did their closing arguments. And the reason for that is, as you did see with Mr. Schleicher, and you will see with Mr. Nelson, the attorneys will refer to the jury instructions, refer to the law. So that's why it's very helpful to tell the jurors what the law is before you hear the arguments.
Joe, we want to play a short clip of the closing argument from Steve Schleicher. He's talking here about George Floyd's last breath.
George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant. He asked for help with his very last breath. But Mr. Officer did not help. The defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand, to twist his fingers into the handcuffs that bound him, looking at him, staring down at times the horrified bystanders who had gathered and watched this unfold.
Interesting moment at the end of the closing, Joe, where Steve Schleicher linked sort of the random assortment of bystanders who were there recording video, recording those final moments, with the random collection of citizens of Hennepin County who have been charged with making a decision on guilt or innocence.
That's correct. And that was the best part of his argument. That was the most powerful part. And it also showed the gratuitous nature of what Mr. Chauvin was doing to Mr. Floyd. It showed some cruelty, barbarous nature, and I think that helped the state.
Joe, one of the things that struck me was that it really appears like the prosecution is looking for a conviction on all three charges. They're not just going to be okay with one of these charges. They really laid it out for all three. Is that typical in a case like this?
Yes, this is the biggest case in Minnesota history and the first to be televised. The eyes of the world are watching it. Of course, they want a conviction on all three, because think of it. If the state is trying to prove that this was completely a violation of any type of reasonable use of force by an officer, of course they'd want a conviction on the top count, which is the second-degree unintentional murder.
We are in the middle of a break between the closing argument of the prosecution, standing by for the defense. Joe, one last question before we go live to Esme Murphy, who is covering this trial for us. And I'm curious what you're looking for when the defense gets up there. The defense certainly has the advantage of hearing what the state's closing is. And if you're a defense attorney right now, are you tailoring some things? Are you changing what you're going to say based on what you just heard?
Absolutely. You cannot simply rely on a script. In fact, you shouldn't be looking at your notes much at all, either side. And I would imagine one of the things that the defense will attack is the underlying felony for count one, meaning that we have never been shown, beyond a reasonable doubt, whether Mr. Floyd actually passed out or lost consciousness before death, or if he simply died. And I think the defense is going to point that out. They're going to try to point out any type of unknowns that they could.
All right, Joe Tamburino, thanks for being with us.